Rand Paul absolutely unloaded on Hillary Clinton, exposing her lies to the entire room.
One of the things that disappointed me most about the original 9/11 was no one was fired. We spent trillions of dollars, but there were a lot of human errors. These are judgment errors, and the people who make judgment errors need to be replaced, fired, and no longer in a position of making these judgment calls. So we have a review board. Review board finds 64 different things that we could change. A lot of them are common sense and should be done, but the question is, it's a failure of leadership that they weren't done in advance, and 4 lives were cost because of this. I'm glad that you're accepting responsibility. I think that ultimately with your leaving, you accept the culpability for the worst tragedy since 9/11, and I really mean that. Had I been president at the time, and I found that you did not read the cables from Benghazi, you did not read the cables from Ambassador Stevens, I would have relieved you of your post. I think it's inexcusable. The thing is that, we can understand that you're not reading every cable. I can understand that maybe you're not aware of the cable from the ambassador in Vienna that asked for $100,000 for an electrical charging station. I can understand that maybe you're not aware that your department spent $100,000 on 3 comedians who went to India on a promotional tour called Make Chi Not War. But I think you might be able to understand and might be aware of the $80 million spent on a consulate in Mashar al-Sharif that will never be built. I think it's inexcusable that you did not know about this and that you did not read these cables. I would think by anybody's estimation, Libya has to have been one of the hottest of hot spots around the world. Not to know of the request for securities really, I think, cost these people their lives. Their lives could have been saved had someone been more available, had someone been aware of these things, more on top of the job. And the thing is I don't suspect you of bad motives. The review board said, well, these people weren't willfully negligent. I don't think you were willfully. I don't suspect your motives of wanting to serve your country, but it was a failure of leadership not to be involved. It was a failure of leadership not to know these things. And so I think it is good that you're accepting responsibility because no one else is. And there is a certain amount of culpability to the worst tragedy since 9/11, and I'm glad you're accepting this. Now, my question is the U.S. involved with any procuring of weapons, transfer of weapons, buying, selling, anyhow transferring weapons to Turkey out of Libya?
To Turkey? I will have to take that question for the record. Nobody's ever raised that with me.
It's been in news reports that ships have been leaving from Libya and that they may have weapons. And what I'd like to know is the annex that was close by, were they involved with procuring, buying, selling, obtaining weapons? And were any of these weapons being transferred to other countries, any countries, Turkey included?
Well, Senator, you'll have to direct that question to the agency that ran the annex. And I will see what information is available. And
you're saying you don't know?
I do not know. I don't have any information on that. And, with respect to personnel, Senator, first, that's why we have independent people who review the situation as we did with the Pickering and Mullen ARB. And all 4 individuals identified in the ARB have been removed from their job. Secondly, they've been placed on administrative leave while we step through the personnel process to determine the next steps. Third, both Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen specifically highlighted the reason why this is complicated because under federal statute and regulations, unsatisfactory leadership is not grounds for finding a breach of duty. The ARB did not find these 4 individuals breached their duty. So I have submitted legislation to this committee, to the Congress, to fix this problem so future ARBs will not face the situation.
But here's the problem. The review board has all these recommendations, but there's one thing they failed to address, and I think you've failed to address, and it sets us up for another tragedy like this. They should have never been sent in there without a military guard. This should have been an embassy like in Baghdad in a war zone, and it should have been under military guard, significant military guard, Defense Department command. I don't think the State Department's capable of being in the war zone and protecting these people. I still don't think that. I think another tragedy could happen. I think another tragedy could happen in another war zone around the world. I think someone needs to make an executive decision. Someone needs to take leadership, and with that leadership should should be, that you shouldn't send them in with no Marines. You shouldn't send them in with Marines that are to guard records, not people. You shouldn't send them in with the same kind of ambassador or embassy staff that you have in Paris. I think that's inexcusable.
Well, Senator, the reason I'm here today is to answer questions the best I can. I am the Secretary of State. And the ARB made very clear that the level of responsibility for the failures that they outlined was set at the Assistant Secretary level and below. The administration has sent officials to the Hill more than 30 times. We've given as much information. We've been as transparent as we can. Obviously, we will continue to brief you and others to answer any and all questions that you have about going forward. The reason we put into effect an accountability review board is to take it out of the heat of politics and partisanship and accusations and to put it in the hands of people who have no stake in the outcome. The reason I said make it open, tell the world, is because I believe in transparency. I believe in taking responsibility. And I have done so, and I hope that we're going to be able to see a good working relationship between the State Department and the committee going forward.
Thank you, Senator.
What you just watched was not some ordinary Senate hearing exchange. That was one of the rare moments in Washington where somebody cut through the rehearsed talking points and directly confronted one of the most powerful figures in American politics over a disaster that shocked the country. Rand Paul didn't approach Hillary Clinton like most politicians do in these hearings. He wasn't trying to score a quick viral moment or squeeze out a headline. He was building a case that Benghazi was not just a tragic terrorist attack, but a complete collapse of leadership inside the Obama administration's foreign policy apparatus. And the reason this exchange hit so hard is because Benghazi was already emotional for the American people long before this hearing ever happened. 4 Americans were dead, including Ambassador Chris Stevens, the first U.S. ambassador killed in the line of duty in decades. Americans watched the attack unfold in real time through media coverage while questions kept piling up. Why was security so weak? Why were repeated warnings ignored? Why did the administration initially blame protests over a video instead of immediately acknowledging it was a coordinated terrorist attack? Why did it seem like nobody at the top was ever held personally responsible? Those questions were hanging over this hearing from the very beginning, and Rand Paul came in furious. The moment he started talking about 9/11, you could immediately tell where he was going. He argued that after catastrophic failures, government officials should not simply move on after writing reports and issuing recommendations. He basically said reviews and investigations mean nothing if the people responsible stay in power. That was the core of his argument against Hillary Clinton. He acknowledged the Accountability Review Board had produced dozens of recommendations, but then he asked the obvious question: why were these common-sense protections not already in place before Americans were killed? That's what made this exchange so uncomfortable for Clinton. Rand Paul wasn't arguing about abstract policy. He was arguing about basic competence, and then came the line that completely changed the hearing. I would have relieved you of your post. That sentence landed like a bomb because very few senators speak that bluntly to a sitting Secretary of State during a nationally televised hearing. Most politicians soften their criticism with diplomatic language. Rand Paul intentionally did the opposite. He wanted the public to hear clearly and directly that he believed Hillary Clinton's failures were serious enough to justify firing her. And honestly, politically that mattered, because Hillary Clinton at that point was already being viewed as a likely future presidential candidate. She had spent years building an image as the experienced global stateswoman, the competent manager, the steady hand in international affairs. Benghazi became one of the first major cracks in that carefully built image. Rand Paul understood that. That's why he focused so heavily on the issue of leadership rather than ideology. He wasn't trying to debate liberal versus conservative foreign policy. He was arguing that if a Secretary of State cannot stay informed about urgent security requests coming from one of the most dangerous places in the world, then something is fundamentally broken. And that argument resonated with millions of Americans because Libya at the time was obviously unstable. The Obama administration had helped push for military intervention against Muammar Gaddafi. The regime collapsed. Militias exploded across the country. Extremist groups gained territory. Weapons flooded through the region. Yet despite all of that chaos, American personnel in Benghazi were operating with shockingly weak protection. Rand Paul's frustration came from the idea that the danger should have been obvious to everyone in leadership. And that's why he kept hammering Clinton over the cables and requests for additional security. Now, Clinton defended herself by arguing that the State Department is enormous, and that secretaries cannot personally read every cable or operational detail. On paper, that sounds reasonable. No cabinet secretary personally monitors every single communication. But Rand Paul's counterargument was devastating, because he wasn't talking about some random embassy in a peaceful region. He was talking about Benghazi, Libya, during one of the most unstable periods in the Middle East after the Arab Spring. In his mind, that should have been at the top of everybody's priority list. And honestly, a lot of Americans watching agreed with him. What made the exchange even more damaging was the contrast between how quickly government agencies can react when politicians want something done versus how slowly they moved when diplomats on the ground were begging for more protection. That disconnect became symbolic of a bigger frustration people had with Washington. Americans constantly hear politicians claim they care deeply about national security, diplomacy, and protecting American personnel overseas. But Benghazi created the perception that when real danger emerged, the bureaucracy failed completely. Rand Paul tapped directly into that anger, and noticed something else important in the exchange. Paul specifically said he did not believe Clinton had bad intentions. That part often gets overlooked, but it mattered strategically. He was not accusing her of deliberately wanting Americans harmed. He was accusing her of something potentially more politically dangerous, being detached, inattentive, and ineffective. That's a much harder accusation to defend against because it challenges competence rather than morality. If someone accuses you of evil motives, supporters can rally around you and dismiss the attack as unfair. But when someone accuses you of managerial failure and backs it up with dead Americans, ignored warnings, and security failures, the political damage becomes harder to contain. Then the hearing moved into another explosive area: weapons transfers and the mysterious activity surrounding Libya after Gaddafi's fall. Rand Paul asked whether the United States or personnel connected to the annex were involved in moving weapons through Turkey. Now remember, at the time there were already widespread rumors and reports circulating about arms flowing out of Libya into other regional conflicts, especially Syria. Libya had become flooded with unsecured weapons after Gaddafi's regime collapsed. The concern was that these weapons were spreading across the Middle East and ending up in dangerous hands. Clinton responded that she did not know, and said those questions should be directed toward the agency running the annex. That answer only intensified suspicions for many viewers because Benghazi was already surrounded by unanswered questions. Every vague response, every claim of uncertainty, every reference to classified information added to the public perception that the full story was not being told, and whether that perception was fair or not politically almost didn't matter anymore. Once public trust starts collapsing, people begin assuming there's more being hidden. That's one reason Benghazi became such a defining political issue for years afterward. But one of the strongest arguments Rand Paul made came near the end when he questioned whether the State Department should even be operating facilities in active war zones without major military protection. That point gets less attention today, but it was incredibly important. Paul essentially argued that modern diplomacy in unstable regions cannot function with normal peacetime security assumptions. He believed Benghazi should have been treated more like Baghdad during the Iraq War, with overwhelming military security protecting American personnel. And honestly, looking back now after everything that has happened across the Middle East over the last decade, that warning looks far more serious than many people admitted at the time. The broader foreign policy establishment often assumed diplomacy and limited intervention could stabilize dangerous regions quickly. But Libya became an example of how rapidly situations can spiral out of control once governments collapse and power vacuums emerge. Benghazi became symbolic of the unintended consequences of intervention without long-term stability planning. That's why conservatives hammered the Obama administration so hard over this issue. To them, Benghazi represented more than a security failure. It represented what they viewed as naive foreign policy thinking that underestimated the dangers of instability and radical extremism. And politically, this hearing also fed into a larger narrative that followed Hillary Clinton into the 2016 election. For years afterward, opponents repeatedly brought up Benghazi as evidence that Clinton represented the worst instincts of the Washington establishment: endless bureaucracy, lack of accountability, foreign policy failures, and political damage control instead of transparency. Her supporters argued that Republicans politicized the tragedy unfairly. And to be fair, Benghazi absolutely became political. Both parties used it to energize their bases. But what made the issue so powerful is that underneath the politics were genuine unresolved questions and real emotional anger from Americans who felt their government failed people serving overseas. That emotional weight never fully disappeared. And you can actually see two completely different philosophies collide during this hearing. Rand Paul's philosophy was straightforward. Leadership means personal accountability. If disaster happens under your watch, you own it. Clinton's philosophy leaned more toward institutional accountability. She emphasized review boards, procedures, investigations, transparency efforts, and structural reforms. But the problem for Clinton was that institutional language often sounds cold and bureaucratic when Americans are angry and grieving. People do not emotionally connect to phrases like administrative review process after watching Americans die overseas. That's why Rand Paul's blunt language connected so strongly with viewers. He spoke emotionally and directly. He framed the issue in human terms instead of procedural terms, and honestly, this hearing was also a preview of the broader anti-establishment anger that would soon explode across American politics. A growing number of Americans were losing trust in institutions entirely. They believed powerful people operated under different rules than ordinary citizens. They believed failure inside Washington rarely carried consequences. Benghazi became one more example reinforcing that perception. That distrust didn't disappear. If anything, it only grew larger over the following decade. And looking back now, it's amazing how many themes from this hearing still dominate politics today. Distrust of government agencies, frustration with bureaucratic leadership, anger over lack of accountability, debates over interventionist foreign policy, and public suspicion toward official narratives during crises. That's why this exchange still circulates online years later. It wasn't just about Benghazi. It was about whether powerful leaders in Washington are ever truly held responsible when catastrophic failures happen under their watch. And for millions of Americans watching at the time, Rand Paul voiced a frustration they believed the political establishment desperately wanted to avoid. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Rand Paul was justified in directly blaming Hillary Clinton for Benghazi, or was the hearing unfairly politicized? Let me know below.